Satoshi series. Chapter 1 is broken up into 14 parts, covering Satoshi's activities on the cryptography mailing list in November of 2008, which is before the launch of the Bitcoin network in early January of 2009. The hope with this series is that by passively listening to Satoshi's conversations, you will receive a general impression of the character of Satoshi and the work he put into creating and launching Bitcoin. Without further ado, here is Chapter 1, Part 1 of Satoshi.
On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Castle Church, thus marking the inception of a movement that would culminate in the separation of church and state. 491 years later to the day, on Halloween, Satoshi Nakamoto fired off this first email to the cryptography mailing list announcing Bitcoin, foreshadowing the separation of money and state. Subject: Bitcoin P2P cash paper. I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party. The paper is available at bitcoin.org/bitcoin.pdf. The main properties: double spending is prevented with a peer-to-peer network, no mint or other trusted parties. Participants can be anonymous. New coins are made from Hashcash-style proof of work. The proof of work for new coin generation also powers the network to prevent double spending. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without the burdens of going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. The network timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. The longest chain not only serves as proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that it came from the largest pool of CPU power. As long as honest nodes control the most CPU power on the network, they can generate the longest chain and outpace any attackers. The network itself requires minimal structure. Messages are broadcasted on a best effort basis, and nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain as proof of what happened while they were gone. Full paper at bitcoin.org/bitcoin.pdf. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 2.
I think the Bitcoin white paper is one of the most seminal works of computer science in the last 20, 30 years. It's poetry.
Welcome to our deep dive read-through of one of the most revolutionary documents in recent memory, Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin white paper. Published on October 31st, 2008, to the cryptography mailing list. This 9-page paper laid the foundation for the most secure, decentralized, peer-to-peer digital currency, Bitcoin. But what makes this document so significant? In a world where trust in traditional financial systems is wavering, Nakamoto's cypherpunk vision is clear. Create a system that operates without the need for intermediaries like banks or governments. Instead, no trust is needed with a peer-to-peer network built through cryptographic proofs. In this video, we'll read through the Bitcoin white paper in full. So whether you're new to Bitcoin or looking to deepen your understanding, this is the perfect starting point. So, let's jump in and explore the innovation that continues to shape the future of money.
Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Satoshi Nakamoto. SatoshiN@gmx.com. Bitcoin.org. Abstract. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. The network timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. The longest chain not only serves as proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that it came from the largest pool of CPU power. As long as a majority of CPU power is controlled by nodes that are not cooperating to attack the network, they'll generate the longest chain and outpace attackers. The network itself requires minimal structure. Messages are broadcast on a best effort basis, and nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain as proof of what happened while they were gone. Introduction. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. Completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible, since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. The cost of mediation increases transaction costs, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions. And there is a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. Merchants must be wary of their customers, hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency, but no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted party. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. Transactions that are computationally impractical to reverse would protect sellers from fraud, and routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. In this paper, we propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer distributed timestamp server to generate computational proof of the chronological order of transactions. The system is secure as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacker nodes. Transactions. We define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. Each owner transfers the coin to the next by digitally signing a hash of the previous transaction and the public key of the next owner, and adding these to the end of the coin. A payee can verify the signatures to verify the chain of ownership. The problem, of course, is the payee can't verify that one of the owners did not double spend the coin. A common solution is to introduce a trusted central authority, or mint, that checks every transaction for double spending. After each transaction, the coin must be returned to the mint to issue a new coin, and only coins issued directly from the mint are trusted not to be double spent. The problem with this solution is that the fate of the entire money system depends on the company running the mint, with every transaction having to go through them, just like a bank. We need a way for the payee to know that the previous owners did not sign any earlier transactions. For our purposes, the earliest transaction is the one that counts, so we don't care about later attempts to double spend. The only way to confirm the absence of a transaction is to be aware of all transactions. In the mint-based model, the mint was aware of all transactions and decided which arrived first. To accomplish this without a trusted party, transactions must be publicly announced, and we need a system for participants to agree on a single history of the order in which they were received. The payee needs proof that at the time of each transaction, the majority of nodes agreed it was the first received. Timestamp server. The solution we propose begins with a timestamp server. A timestamp server works by taking a hash of a block of items, to be timestamped and widely publishing the hash, such as in a newspaper or Usenet post. The timestamp proves that the data must have existed at the time, obviously, in order to get into the hash. Each timestamp includes the previous timestamp in its hash, forming a chain, with each additional timestamp reinforcing the ones before it. Proof of work. To implement a distributed timestamp server on a peer-to-peer basis, we will need to use a proof-of-work system similar to AtomBack's Hashcash rather than newspaper or Usenet posts. The proof-of-work involves scanning for a value that when hashed, such as with SHA-256, the hash begins with a number of 0 bits. The average work required is exponential in the number of 0 bits required and can be verified by executing a single hash. For our timestamp network, we implement the proof of work by incrementing a nonce in the block until a value is found that gives the block's hash the required 0 bits. Once the CPU effort has been expended to make it satisfy the proof of work, the block cannot be changed without redoing the work. As later blocks are chained after it, the work to change the block would include redoing all the blocks after it. The proof of work also solves the problem of determining representation in majority decision-making. If the majority were based on one IP address, one vote, it could be subverted by anyone able to allocate many IPs. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. The majority decision is represented by the longest chain, which has the greatest proof of work effort invested in it. If a majority of CPU power is controlled by honest nodes, the honest chain will grow the fastest and outpace any competing chains. To modify a pass block, an attacker would have to redo the proof of work of the block and all blocks after it, and then catch up with and surpass the work of the honest nodes. We will show later that the probability of a slower attacker catching up diminishes exponentially as subsequent blocks are added. To compensate for increasing hardware speed and varying interest in running nodes over time, the proof of work difficulty is determined by a moving average, targeting an average number of blocks per hour. If they're generated too fast, the difficulty increases. Network. The steps to run the network are as follows. 1. New transactions are broadcast to all nodes. 2. Each node collects new transactions into a block. 3. Each node works on finding a difficult proof of work for its block. 4. When a node finds a proof of work, it broadcasts the block to all nodes. 5. Nodes accept the block only if all transactions in it are valid and not already spent. 6. Nodes express their acceptance of the block by working on creating the next block in the chain, using the hash of the accepted block as the previous hash. Nodes always consider the longest chain to be the correct one and will keep working on extending it. If two nodes broadcast different versions of the next block simultaneously, some nodes may receive one or the other first. In that case, they work on the first one they received, but save the other branch in case it becomes longer. The tie will be broken when the next proof of work is found and one branch becomes longer. The nodes that were working on the other branch will then switch to the longer one. New transaction broadcasts do not necessarily need to reach all nodes. As long as they reach many nodes, they will get into a block before long. Block broadcasts are also tolerant of dropped messages. If a node does not receive a block, it will request it when it receives the next block and realizes it missed one. Incentive. By convention, the first transaction in a block is a special transaction that starts a new coin owned by the creator of the block. This adds an incentive for nodes to support the network and provides a way to initially distribute coins into circulation, since there is no central authority to issue them. The steady addition of a constant amount of new coins is analogous to gold miners expending resources to add gold to circulation. In our case, it is CPU time and electricity that is expended. The incentive can also be funded with transaction fees. If the output value of a transaction is less than its input value, the difference is a transaction fee that is added to the incentive value of the block containing the transaction. Once a predetermined number of coins have entered circulation, the incentive can transition entirely to transaction fees and be completely inflation-free. The incentive may help encourage nodes to stay honest. If a greedy attacker is able to assemble more CPU power than all the honest nodes, he would have to choose between using it to defraud people by stealing back his payments, or using it to generate new coins. He ought to find it more profitable to play by the rules, such rules that favor him with more new coins than everyone else combined, than to undermine the system and the validity of his own wealth. Reclaiming disk space. Once the latest transaction in a coin is buried under enough blocks, the spent transactions before it can be discarded to save disk space. To facilitate this, without breaking the block's hash, transactions are hashed in a Merkle tree, with only the root included in the block's hash. Old blocks can then be compacted by stubbing off branches of the tree. The interior hashes do not need to be stored. A block header with no transactions would be about 80 bytes. If we suppose blocks are generated every 10 minutes, 80 bytes times 6 times 24 times 365 equals 4.2 megabytes per year. With computer systems typically selling with 2 gigabytes of RAM as of 2008, and Moore's law predicting current growth of 1.2 gigabytes per year, storage should not be a problem even if the block headers must be kept in memory. Simplified payment verification. It is possible to verify payments without running a full network node. A user only needs to keep a copy of the block headers of the longest proof-of-work chain, which he can get by querying network nodes until he's convinced he has the longest chain, and obtain the Merkle branch linking the transaction to the block it's timestamped in. He can't check the transaction for himself, but by linking it to a place in the chain, he can see that a network node has accepted it, and blocks added after it further confirm the network has accepted it. As such, the verification is reliable as long as honest nodes control the network, but is more vulnerable if the network is overpowered by an attacker. While network nodes can verify transactions for themselves, the simplified method can be fooled by an attacker's fabricated transactions for as long as the attacker can continue to overpower the network. One strategy to protect against this would be to accept alerts from network nodes when they detect an invalid block, prompting the user's software to download the full block and alerted transactions to confirm the inconsistency. Businesses that receive frequent payments will probably still want to run their own nodes for more independent security and quicker verification. Combining and splitting value. Although it would be possible to handle coins individually, it would be unwieldy to make a separate transaction for every cent in a transfer. To allow value to be split and combined, transactions contain multiple inputs and outputs. Normally, there will be either a single input from a larger previous transaction or multiple inputs combining smaller amounts, and at most 2 outputs, one for the payment and one returning the change, if any, back to the sender. It should be noted that fanout, where a transaction depends on several transactions and those transactions depend on many more, is not a problem here. There is never the need to extract a complete standalone copy of a transaction's history. Privacy. The traditional banking model achieves a level of privacy by limiting access to information to the parties involved and the trusted third party. The necessity to announce all transactions publicly precludes this method, but privacy can still be maintained by breaking the flow of information in another place. By keeping public keys anonymous, the public can see that someone is sending an amount to someone else, but without information linking the transaction to anyone. This is similar to the level of information released by stock exchanges, where the time and size of individual trades, the tape, is made public but without telling who the parties were. As an additional firewall, a new key pair should be used for each transaction to keep them from being linked to a common owner. Some linking is still unavoidable with multi-input transactions, which necessarily reveal that their inputs were owned by the same owner. The risk is that if the owner of a key is revealed, linking could reveal other transactions that belong to the same owner. Calculations. We consider the scenario of an attacker trying to generate an alternate chain faster than the honest chain. Even if this is accomplished, it does not throw the system open to arbitrary changes, such as creating value out of thin air or taking money that never belonged to the attacker. Nodes are not going to accept an invalid transaction as payment, and honest nodes will never accept a block containing them. An attacker can only try to change one of his own transactions to take back money he recently spent. The race between the honest chain and an attacker chain can be characterized as a binomial random walk. The success event is the honest chain being extended by one block, increasing its lead by +1, and the failure event is the attacker's chain being extended by one block, reducing the gap by -1. The probability of an attacker catching up from a given deficit is analogous to a gambler's ruin problem. Suppose a gambler with unlimited credit starts at a deficit and plays potentially an infinite number of trials to try to reach break-even. We can calculate the probability he ever reaches break-even, or that an attacker ever catches up with the honest chain, as follows. P equals probability, an honest node finds the next block. Q equals probability the attacker finds the next block. QZ equals probability. The attacker will ever catch up from Z blocks behind. QZ is equal to 1 if P is less than or equal to Q, and Q divided by P to the Z if P is greater Q. Given our assumption that P is greater than Q, the probability drops exponentially as the number of blocks the attacker has to catch up with increases. With the odds against him, if he doesn't make a lucky lunge forward early on, his chances become vanishingly small as he falls further behind. We now consider how long the recipient of a new transaction needs to wait before being sufficiently certain the sender can't change the transaction. We assume the sender is an attacker who wants to make the recipient believe he paid him for a while, then switch it to pay back to himself after some time has passed. The receiver will be alerted when that happens, but the sender hopes it will be too late. The receiver generates a new key pair and gives the public key to the sender shortly before signing. This prevents the sender from preparing a chain of blocks ahead of time by working on it continuously until he is lucky enough to get far enough ahead, then executing the transaction at that moment. Once the transaction is sent, the dishonest sender starts working in secret on a parallel chain containing an alternate version of his transaction. The recipient waits until the transaction has been added to a block and Z blocks have been linked after it. He doesn't know the exact amount of progress the attacker has made, but assuming the honest blocks took the average expected time per block, the attacker's potential progress will be a Poisson distribution with expected value, lambda equals Z times Q over P. To get the probability the attacker could still catch up now, we multiply the Poisson density for each amount of progress he could have made by the probability he could catch up from that point, the sum over k from 0 to infinity of e to the minus lambda times lambda to the k over k factorial, where each term with k less than or equal to z is multiplied by q over p to the power of z minus k. Rearranging to avoid summing the infinite tail of the distribution, 1 minus the sum for k equals 0 to z of lambda to the power of k times e to the power of negative lambda divided by k factorial times the quantity minus the quantity q divided by p, closed quantity, that quantity to the power of quantity z minus k, closed quantity, closed quantity. Converting to C code, pound include math.h double attacker success probability double q integer z double p equals 1.0 minus q, double lambda equals z times q divided by p. Double sum equals 1.0. Integer I and k. For k equals 0, k less than or equal to z, k plus plus, double Poisson equals exponential of negative lambda. For I equals 1, I less than or equal to k, I plus plus. Poisson times equal lambda divided by I. Sum minus equals Poisson times 1 minus power of q divided by p, comma z minus k. Return sum. Running some results, we can see the probability drop off exponentially with z. Solving for p less than 0.1%. Conclusion. We have proposed a system for electronic transactions without relying on trust. We started with the usual framework of coins made from digital signatures, which provide strong control of ownership, but is incomplete without a way to prevent double spending. To solve this, we proposed a peer-to-peer network using proof of work to record a public history of transactions that quickly becomes computationally impractical for an attacker to change if honest nodes control a majority of CPU power. The network is robust in its unstructured simplicity. Nodes work all at once with little coordination. They do not need to be identified, since messages are not routed to any particular place and only need to be delivered on a best effort basis. Nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the proof of work chain as proof of what happened while they were gone. They vote with their CPU power, expressing their acceptance of valid blocks by working on extending them, and rejecting invalid blocks by refusing to work on them. Any needed rules and incentives can be enforced with this consensus mechanism. References: Wei Dai, B. Money, 1998. H. Macias, XS Avila, and J.J. Quisqueter, Design of a Secure Timestamping Service with Minimal Trust Requirements, in 20th Symposium on Information Theory in the Benelux, May 1999. S. Haber and W.S. Stornetta, How to Timestamp a Digital Document, in Journal of Cryptology, 1991. D. Bayer, S. Habra, and W.S. Stornetta, Improving the Efficiency and Reliability of Digital Timestamping, in Sequences 2, Methods in Communication, Security, and Computer Science, 1993. S. Haber, W.S. Stornetta, Secure Names for Bit Strings, in Proceedings of the 4th ACM Conference on Computer and Communication Security, April 1997. Adam Back, Hashcash, A Denial of Service Countermeasure, 2002. R.C. Merkel, Protocols for Public Key Cryptosystems, 1980. Symposium on Security and Privacy, April 1980. W. Feller, An Introduction to Probability Theory and Its Applications, 1957.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 3.
November 2008. Amidst the chaos of a global financial crisis, a cryptic figure named Satoshi Nakamoto introduced an idea that would revolutionize money as we know it, Bitcoin. But here's something most people don't know. Before Satoshi mined the first ever Bitcoin Genesis block, he had deep public and private conversations with legendary cypherpunks on the cryptography mailing list. Satoshi received a huge response after posting the white paper to this list. Over 33 follow-up emails ensued, and the discussion became so chaotic the mailing list moderator called for an end to the Bitcoin discussion. In this series, we take you through the timeline of Bitcoin's inception, creation, Satoshi's cryptic clues, and the unfolding mystery of his sudden disappearance. Who was Satoshi Nakamoto? What did he do? Who did he talk to, and what did they talk about? And why did he leave just as Bitcoin was gaining momentum? Join us in this series as we explore the rabbit hole conversations of Satoshi.
On November 2nd, 2008, 2 days after Satoshi released the Bitcoin white paper on the cryptography mailing list, James A. Donald, a Canadian cryptographer, gave this reply. "We very, very much need such a system. But the way I understand your proposal, it does not seem to scale to the required size. For transferable proof of work tokens to have value, they must have monetary value. To have monetary value, they must be transferred within a very large network, for example, a file trading network, akin to BitTorrent. To detect and reject a double spending event in a timely manner, one must have most past transactions of the coins in the transaction, which, naively implemented, requires each peer to have most past transactions, or most past transactions that occurred recently. If hundreds of millions of people are doing transactions, that is a lot of bandwidth. Each must know all, or a substantial part thereof."
Satoshi responded back to James with this reply on the same day. "Long before the network gets anywhere near as large as that, it would be safe for users to use simplified payment verification, Section 8 of the white paper, to check for double spending, which only requires having the chain of block headers, or about 12 kilobytes per day. Only people trying to create new coins would need to run network nodes. At first, most users would run network nodes, but as the network grows beyond a certain point, it would be left more and more to specialists with server farms of specialized hardware. A server farm would only need to have one node on the network, and the rest of the lane connects with that one node. The bandwidth might not be as prohibitive as you think. A typical transaction would be about 400 bytes. ECC is nicely compact. Each transaction has to be broadcast twice, so let's say 1 kilobyte per transaction. Visa processed 37 billion transactions in fiscal year 2008, or an average of 100 million transactions per day. That many transactions would take 100 gigabytes of bandwidth, or the size of 12 DVD or 2 HD quality movies, or about $18 worth of bandwidth at current prices. If the network were to get that big, it would take several years, and by then, sending 2 HD movies over the internet would probably not seem like a big deal." Satoshi Nakamoto.
The next day, on November 3rd, John Levine, an internet expert, replied back to Satoshi's claim that honest nodes control the most CPU power on the network with this message. But they don't. Bad guys routinely control zombie farms of 100,000 machines or more. People I know who run a blacklist of spam sending zombies tell me they often see 1 million new zombies a day. This is the same reason that Hashcash can't work on today's internet. The good guys have vastly less computational firepower than the bad guys. I also have my doubts about other issues, but this one is the killer. Regards, John.
On the same day, Satoshi gave this apt rebuttal to John's concerns. "Thanks for bringing up that point. I didn't really make that statement as strong as I could have. The requirement is that the good guys collectively have more CPU power than any single attacker. There would be many smaller zombie farms that are not big enough to overpower the network, and they could still make money by generating bitcoins. The smaller farms are then the honest nodes. I need a better term than honest. The more smaller farms resort to generating bitcoins, the higher the bar gets to overpower the network, making larger farms also too small to overpower it, so that they may as well generate bitcoins too. According to the long tail theory, the small, medium, and merely large farms put together should add up to a lot more than the biggest zombie farm. Even if a bad guy does overpower the network, it's not like he's instantly rich. All he can accomplish is to take back money he himself spent, like bouncing a check. To exploit it, he would have to buy something from a merchant, wait till it ships, then overpower the network and try to take his money back. I don't think he could make as much money trying to pull a carding scheme like that as he could by generating bitcoins. With a zombie farm that big, he could generate more bitcoins than everyone else combined. The Bitcoin network might actually reduce spam by diverting zombie farms to generating bitcoins instead. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 4.
Satoshi is a long-term video and audio anthology, retelling the story of Satoshi day by day. We'll read through and revisit the conversations Satoshi had with cypherpunks, rebels, and builders alike, and try to retrace Satoshi's digital steps. Join us as we explore Bitcoin and the breadcrumbs its inventor left behind. By early November 2008, Satoshi had received a few negative emails from James Donald doubting Bitcoin's abilities. James, as you will soon find, is a consistent reply guy to these early Bitcoin conversations on the cryptography mailing list. James is somewhat annoying, but it's probably important to understand what Satoshi was reading at the time, since these messages are addressing him directly and may have influenced Satoshi's actions and thinking. This next email by James is very lengthy, but touches on a couple libertarian viewpoints that are interesting but rather nihilistic. We'll also read Satoshi's hopeful response to this email. James sent the following meandering essay on November 3rd. He started by addressing Satoshi's claim that users can run lightweight nodes to protect against double spending. Quote,
If I understand simplified payment verification correctly, new coin issuers need to store all coins and all recent coin transfers. There are many new coin issuers, as many as want to be issuers, but far more coin users. Ordinary entities merely transfer coins. To see if a coin transfer is okay, they report it to one or more new coin issuers and see if the new coin issuer accepts it. New coin issuers check transfers of old coins so that their new coins have valid form. And they report the outcome of this check so that people will report their transfers to the new coin issuer. If someone double spends a coin and one expenditure is reported to one new coin issuer and the other simultaneously reported to another new coin issuer, then both issuers to swiftly agree on a unique sequence order of payments. This, however, is a non-trivial problem of a massively distributed, massive database. A notoriously tricky problem, for which there are at present no peer-to-peer solutions. Obviously, it is a solvable problem. People solve it all the time, but not an easy problem. People fail to solve it rather more frequently. But let us suppose that the coin issue network is dominated by a small number of issuers, as seems likely. If a small number of entities are issuing new coins, this is more resistant to state attack than with a single issuer. But the government regularly attacks financial networks, with the financial collapse ensuing from the most recent attack still underway as I write this. Government-sponsored enterprises enter the business. In due course, bad behavior is made mandatory, and the evil financial network is bigger than the honest financial network, with the result that even though everyone knows what is happening, people continue to use the paper issued by the evil financial network because of network effects. The big, main issuers are the issuers you use if you want to do business. Then knowledgeable people complain that the evil financial network is heading for disaster, that the government-sponsored enterprises are about to cause a collapse of the total financial system. As Wallison and Alan Greenspan complained in 2005, the government debates shrinking the evil government-sponsored enterprises, as with S190, Federal Housing Enterprise Regulatory Reform Act of 2005. But they find easy money too seductive, and S190 goes down in flames before a horde of political activists chanting that easy money is sound and opposing it is racist, Nazi, ignorant, and generally hateful. The recent S190 debate on limiting portfolios, bond issue supporting dud mortgages by government-sponsored enterprises being a perfect reprise of the debates on limiting the issue of new assignats in the 1790s. The big and easy government attacks on money target a single central money issuer, as with the first of the modern political attacks, the French assignat of 1792. But in the late 19th century, political attacks on financial networks began, as for example the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the goal always being to wind up the network into a single, too-big-to-fail entity. And they have been getting progressively bigger, more serious, and more disastrous, as with the most recent one. Each attack is hugely successful, and after the cataclysm that the attack causes, the attackers are hailed as saviors of the poor, the oppressed, and the nation generally. And the blame for the bad consequences is dumped elsewhere, usually on Jews, greedy bankers, speculators, etc., because such attacks are difficult for ordinary people to understand. I have trouble understanding your proposal. Ordinary users will be easily bamboozled by a government-sponsored security update. Further, when the crisis hits, to disagree with the line, to doubt that the regulators are right, and the problem is the evil speculators, becomes political suicide, as it did in America in 2007, sometimes physical suicide, as in Weimar Germany. Still, it is better and more resistant to attack by government-sponsored enterprises than anything I have seen so far. In regards to your comments about the resilience and bandwidth of the Bitcoin network, if there were 100 or 1,000 money issuers by the time the government attacks, the kind of government attacks on financial networks that we have recently seen might well be more difficult. But I think we need to concern ourselves with minimizing the data and bandwidth required by money issuers. For small coins, the protocol seems wasteful. It would be nice to have the full protocol for big coins, and some shortcut for small coins, wherein people trust account-based money for small amounts, till they get wrapped up into big coins. The smaller the data storage and bandwidth required for money issuers, the more resistant the system is to the kind of government attacks on financial networks that we have recently seen.
3 days later, on Thursday, November 6th, Satoshi replied back to James, describing his last email as a, quote, lengthy exposition of the vulnerability of a system to use of force monopolies elided, and that James was claiming you will not find a solution to political problems in cryptography. Satoshi then wrote in response to this claim, yes, but we can win a major battle in the arms race and gain a new territory of freedom for several years. Governments are good at cutting off the heads of centrally controlled networks like Napster, but pure peer-to-peer networks like Gnutella and Tor seem to be holding their own. Satoshi.
A day after Satoshi sent this email to James, the moderator of the cryptography mailing list, Perry E. Metzger, sent out this, quote, edict of the day, warning James and Satoshi to limit their political discussions. Quote, a bunch of people seem anxious to branch the discussion of cryptographic cash protocols off into a discussion of the politics of money. I'm a rabid libertarian myself, but this isn't the rabid libertarian mailing list. Please stick to discussing either the protocols themselves or their direct practicality, and not the perils of fiat money, taxation, your Aunt Mildred's gold coin collection, etc. Perry.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 5.
On November 6, 2008, Ray Dillinger entered the Bitcoin conversation on the cryptography mailing list. Dillinger is a respected computer scientist and cryptographer with early involvement in digital cash projects. He was among the first to review Satoshi Nakamoto's original Bitcoin code before Bitcoin's public launch in January of 2009. Before this launch, he claims to have helped check for potential rounding errors in the code, which could cause strange accounting behavior. He ended up not finding any rounding errors in Satoshi's code.
In response to James Donald's last email to the cryptography mailing list, Ray Dillinger, aka Bear, otherwise known as Credit, sent this reply. I think the real issue with this system is the market for bitcoins. Computing proofs of work have no intrinsic value. We can have a limited supply curve, although the currency is inflationary at about 35%, as that's how much faster computers get annually. But there is no demand curve that intersects it at a positive price point. I know the same. Lack of intrinsic value can be said of fiat currencies. But an artificial demand for fiat currencies is created by, among other things, taxation and legal tender laws. Also, even a fiat currency can be an inflation hedge against another fiat currency's higher rate of inflation. But in the case of bitcoins, the inflation rate of 35% is almost guaranteed by the technology. There are no supporting mechanisms for taxation and no legal tender laws. People will not hold assets in this highly inflationary currency if they can help it. Bear.
In response to Ray Dillinger's uninformed claim that Bitcoin is inflationary at 35%, Satoshi gave this reply on Saturday, November 8, 2008. Increasing hardware speed is handled. To compensate for increasing hardware speed and varying interest in running nodes over time, the proof-of-work difficulty is determined by a moving average targeting an average number of blocks per hour. If they're generated too fast, the difficulty increases. As computers get faster and the total computing power applied to creating bitcoins increases, the difficulty increases proportionally to keep the total new production constant. Thus, it is known in advance how many new bitcoins will be created every year in the future. The fact that new coins are produced means the money supply increases by a planned amount, but this does not necessarily result in inflation. If the supply of money increases at the same rate that the number of people using it increases, prices remain stable. If it does not increase as fast as demand, there will be deflation and early holders of money will see its value increase. Coins have to get initially distributed somehow, and a constant rate seems like the best formula. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 6.
By early November 2008, Satoshi's Bitcoin white paper had mostly received discouraging feedback. There were Dillinger's negative inflation remarks, James and Levine claiming Bitcoin wouldn't work, and even the moderator of the cryptography mailing list was not too friendly with the Bitcoin discussion going on. Satoshi may have been feeling a bit down about his invention, which at this point was not yet complete. Would he throw in the towel after so much pushback? Trying to describe the discovery of fire to Neanderthals wasn't going so well. But suddenly, on Friday, November the 7th, Hal Finney enters the chat with this email. Bitcoin seems to be a very promising idea. I like the idea of basing security on the assumption that the CPU power of honest participants outweighs that of the attacker. It is a very modern notion that exploits the power of the long tail. When Wikipedia started, I never thought it would work, but it has proven to be a great success for some of the same reasons. I also do think that there is potential value in a form of unforgeable token whose production rate is predictable and can't be influenced by corrupt parties. This would be more analogous to gold than to fiat currencies. Nick Szabo wrote many years ago about what he called BitGold, and this could be an implementation of that concept. There have also been proposals for building lightweight anonymous payment schemes on top of heavyweight non-anonymous systems, so Bitcoin could be leveraged to allow for anonymity even beyond the mechanisms discussed in the paper. Unfortunately, I am having trouble fully understanding the system. The paper describes key concepts and some data structures, but does not clearly specify the various rules and verifications that the participants in the system would have to follow. In particular, I don't understand exactly what verifications peer-to-peer nodes perform when they receive new blocks from other nodes, and how they handle transactions that have been broadcast to them. For example, it is mentioned that if a broadcast transaction does not reach all nodes, it is okay, as it will get into the blockchain before long. How does this happen? What if the node that creates the next block, the first node to find the hash-cache collision, did not hear about the transaction, and then a few more blocks get added also by nodes that did not hear about that transaction? Do all the nodes that did hear it keep that transaction around, hoping to incorporate it into a block once they get lucky enough to be the one which finds the next collision?
On Saturday, November 8th, Satoshi replied to this question from Hal in a follow-up email with this answer. Right. Nodes keep transactions in their working set until they get into a block. If a transaction reaches 90% of nodes, then each time a new block is found, it has a 90% chance of being in it. Hal then asked,
Or, for example, what if a node is keeping 2 or more chains around, as it waits to see which grows fastest, and a block comes in for chain A, which would include a double spend of a coin that is in chain B? Is that checked for or not? This might happen if someone double spent, and 2 different sets of nodes heard about the 2 different transactions with the same coin. This kind of data management and the rules for handling all the packets that are flowing around is largely missing from the paper.
Satoshi answered, that does not need to be checked for. The transaction in whichever branch ends up getting ahead becomes the valid one, the other is invalid. If someone tries to double spend like that, one and only one spend will always become valid, the other's invalid. Receivers of transactions will normally need to hold transactions for perhaps an hour or more to allow time for this kind of possibility to be resolved. They can still respend the coins immediately, but they should wait before taking an action such as shipping goods. Then Hal asked,
I also don't understand exactly how double spending or canceling transactions is accomplished by a superior attacker who is able to muster more computing power than all the honest participants. I see that he can create new blocks and add them to create the longest chain, but how can he erase or add old transactions in the chain? As the attacker sends out his new blocks, aren't there consistency checks which honest nodes can perform to make sure that nothing got erased? More explanation of this attack would be helpful in order to judge the gains to an attacker from this, versus simply using his computing power to mint new coins honestly.
Satoshi replied, the attacker isn't adding blocks to the end. He has to go back and redo the block his transaction is in and all the blocks after it, as well as any new blocks the network keeps adding to the end while he's doing that. He's rewriting history. Once his branch is longer, it becomes the new valid one. This touches on a key point. Even though everyone present may see the shenanigans going on, there's no way to take advantage of that fact. It is strictly necessary that the longest chain is always considered the valid one. Nodes that were present may remember that one branch was there first and got replaced by another, but there would be no way for them to convince those who were not present of this. We can't have sub-factions of nodes that cling to one branch that they think was first, others that saw another branch first, and others that joined later and never saw what happened. The CPU power proof of work vote must have the final say. The only way for everyone to stay on the same page is to believe that the longest chain is always the valid one, no matter what. Hal then asks,
As far as the spending transactions, what checks does the recipient of a coin have to perform? Does she need to go back through the coin's entire history of transfers and make sure that every transaction on the list is indeed linked into the timestamp blockchain? Or can she just do the latest one?
Satoshi answered, the recipient just needs to verify it back to a depth that is sufficiently far back in the blockchain, which will often only require a depth of 2 transactions. All transactions before that can be discarded. Hal then asked Satoshi,
do the timestamp nodes check transactions, making sure that the previous transaction on a coin is in the chain, thereby enforcing the rule that all transactions in the chain represent valid coins?
Satoshi replied with, right, exactly. When a node receives a block, it checks the signatures of every transaction in it against previous transactions in blocks. Blocks can only contain transactions that depend on valid transactions in previous blocks or the same block. Transaction C could depend on transaction B in the same block, and B depends on transaction A in an earlier block. Hal finishes his email by saying,
Sorry about all the questions, but as I said, this does seem to be a very promising and original idea, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the concept is further developed. It would be helpful to see a more process-oriented description of the idea, with concrete details of the data structures for the various objects, coins, blocks, transactions, the data which is included in messages, and algorithmic descriptions of the procedures for handling the various events which would occur in this system. You mentioned that you are working on an implementation, but I think a more formal text description of the system would be a helpful next step. Hal Finney.
Satoshi finishes his response to Hal's email with, I appreciate your questions. I actually did this kind of backwards. I had to write all the code before I could convince myself that I could solve every problem. Then I wrote the paper. I think I will be able to release the code sooner than I could write a detailed spec. You're already right about most of your assumptions where you filled in the blanks. Satoshi Nakamoto. One of the many interesting things about this Satoshi email is his confirmation that he had Bitcoin code almost ready to go on November 8th. He would eventually share this draft code with Hal Finney, James A. Donald, and Ray Dillinger. He may have shared the Bitcoin source code with other people at the time, but those three names are the only ones CC'd on a November 18th Hal Finney email that replies to Satoshi. That personal Hal Finney email is titled RE Bitcoin source files attached. Therefore, this implies Satoshi shared his draft Bitcoin code with others sometime between November 8th and November 18th, 2008. In a future segment, we will take a look at this November 2008 draft code and compare it to the released version of Bitcoin source code in January of 2009, 2 months later. On a final note, for those who don't know, Hal Finney is a legendary cryptographer who contributed to Bitcoin and the computer science space throughout his life. He was one of the key people behind PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, and, as we hope to show here, was instrumental in Bitcoin's inception. He also made some of the earliest console games. He is a beloved father and husband.
Making this recording for a few reasons.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 7.
On Saturday, November the 8th, 2008, Satoshi replied back to a strange email by James A. Donald. This email is a bit odd, since the record for it is missing from the cryptography mailing list. All we know about it is the quoted text embedded within Satoshi's response, which repeats what James apparently wrote in that missing email. One possible explanation for this missing email is that it was sent privately by James to Satoshi and not to the public mailing list. In any case, Satoshi gives his response to James on the mailing list, where everyone can see. James's missing email stated, quote, "The core concept is that lots of entities keep complete and consistent information as to who owns which bitcoins. But maintaining consistency is tricky. It is not clear to me what happens when someone reports one transaction to one maintainer, and someone else transports another transaction to another maintainer. The transaction cannot be known to be valid until it has been incorporated into a globally shared view of all past transactions, and no one can know that a globally shared view of all past transactions is globally shared until after some time has passed and after many new transactions have arrived. Did you explain how to do this, and it just passed over my head? Or were you confident it could be done and a bit vague as to the details?" Satoshi responded to this with, quote,
The proof-of-work chain is the solution to the synchronization problem, and to knowing what the globally shared view is without having to trust anyone. A transaction will quickly propagate throughout the network, So if two versions of the same transaction were reported at close to the same time, the one with the head start would have a big advantage in reaching many more nodes first. Nodes will only accept the first one they see, refusing the second one to arrive, so the earlier transaction would have many more nodes working on incorporating it into the next proof of work. In effect, each node votes for its viewpoint of which transaction it saw first by including it in its proof of work effort. If the transactions did come at exactly the same time, and there was an even split, it's a toss-up based on which gets into a proof of work first, and that decides which is valid. When a node finds a proof of work, the new block is propagated throughout the network, and everyone adds it to the chain and starts working on the next block after it. Any nodes that had the other transaction will stop trying to include it in a block, since it's now invalid according to the accepted chain. The proof of work chain is itself self-evident proof that it came from the globally shared view. Only the majority of the network together has enough CPU power to generate such a difficult chain of proof of work. Any user, upon receiving the proof of work chain, can see what the majority of the network has approved. Once a transaction is hashed into a link that's a few links back in the chain, it is firmly etched into the global history. Satoshi Nakamoto.
On Sunday, November the 9th, 2008, James A. Donald replied to a Satoshi email. This time, James wrote, quote, "This does not work. Your proposal involves complications I do not think you have thought through. Furthermore, it cannot be made to work. As in the proposed system, the work of tracking who owns what coins is paid for by seigniorage, which requires inflation. This is not an intolerable flaw. Predictable inflation is less objectionable than inflation that gets jiggered around from time to transfer wealth from one voting block to another."
Satoshi replied back on the same day with, quote, "If you're having trouble with the inflation issue, it's easy to tweak it for transaction fees instead. It's as simple as this. Let the output value from any transaction be 1 cent less than the input value. Either the client software automatically writes transactions for 1 cent more than the intended payment value, or it could come out of the payee's side. The incentive value when a node finds a proof of work for a block could be the total of the fees in the block." Satoshi Nakamoto.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 8.
On Sunday, November 9th, 2008, James Donald replied to an email he received from Satoshi the previous day. In it, Satoshi explained that double-spent transactions were rejected by nodes on the Bitcoin network, who would only work with the first transaction received. James then asked this clarifying question on what happens when two different nodes find a valid but different block at the same time. Quote, "Okay. Suppose one node incorporates a bunch of transactions in its proof of work, all of them honest, legitimate single spends, and another node incorporates a slightly different bunch of transactions in its proof of work, all of them equally honest, legitimate single spends, and both proofs are generated at about the same time. What happens then?"
Satoshi answered this question on the same day with the following email. Quote, "They both broadcast their blocks. All nodes receive them and keep both, but only work on the one they received first. We'll suppose exactly half received one first, half the other. In a short time, all the transactions will finish propagating so that everyone has the full set. The nodes working on each side will be trying to add the transactions that are missing from their side. When the next proof of work is found, whichever previous block that node was working on, that branch becomes longer and the tie is broken. Whichever side it is, the new block will contain the other half of the transactions, so in either case, the branch will contain all transactions. Even in the unlikely event that a split happened twice in a row, both sides of the second split would contain the full set of transactions anyway. It's not a problem if transactions have to wait one or a few extra cycles to get into a block." Satoshi Nakamoto.
James asked more follow-up questions related to what we now know as the block time target of 10 minutes. Quote, "So what happened to the coin that lost the race? On the one hand, we want people who make coins to be motivated to keep and record all transactions and obtain an up-to-date record of all transactions in a timely manner. On the other hand, it is a bit harsh if the guy who came second is likely to lose his coin."
Satoshi responded to this with, when there are multiple double-spent versions of the same transaction, one and only one will become valid. The receiver of a payment must wait an hour or so before believing that it's valid. The network will resolve any possible double-spend races by then. The guy who received the double spend that became invalid never thought he had it in the first place. His software would have shown the transaction go from unconfirmed to invalid. If necessary, the UI can be made to hide transactions until they're sufficiently deep in the blockchain. James continued his email with, quote,
"Further, your description of events implies restrictions on timing and coin generation. That the entire network generates coins slowly compared to the time required for news of a new coin to flood the network."
Satoshi clarified some details by saying, quote, "Sorry if I didn't make that clear. The target time between blocks will probably be 10 minutes. Every block includes its creation time. If the time is off by more than 36 hours, other nodes won't work on it. If the time span over the last 6 times 24 times 30 blocks is less than 15 days, blocks are being generated too fast and the proof of work difficulty doubles. Everyone does the same calculation with the same chain data, so they all get the same result at the same link in the chain." James then said, quote,
"Otherwise, the chains diverge more and more, and no one ever knows which chain is the winner. You need to make these restrictions explicit, for network flood time may well be quite slow, which implies that the new coin rate is slower. We want spenders to have certainty that their transaction is valid at the time it takes a spend to flood the network, not at the time it takes for branch races to be resolved."
Satoshi answered, "Instant non-repudiability is not a feature, but it's still much faster than existing systems. Paper checks can bounce up to a week or two later. Credit card transactions can be contested up to 60 to 180 days later. Bitcoin transactions can be sufficiently irreversible in an hour or two." James then said, quote,
"At any given time, for example at 1,009,138 seconds, we can look back at the past and say, at 1,008,737 seconds, Node 5 was it, and he incorporated all the coins he had discovered into the chain, and all the new transactions he knew about on top of the previous link. At 1,008,792 seconds, Node 2 was it, and he incorporated all the coins he had discovered into the chain, and all the new transactions he knew about into the chain on top of Node 5's link. At 1,008,745 seconds, Node 7 was it, and he incorporated all the coins he had discovered into the chain, and all the new transactions he knew about into the chain on top of Node 2's link. But no one can know who is it right now. So how does one know when to reveal one's coins? One solution is that one does not. One incorporates a hash of the coin secret whenever one thinks one might be it, and after that hashes securely in the chain. After one knows that one was it at the time, one can then safely spend the coin that one has found, revealing the secret. This solution takes care of the coin revelation problem, but does not solve the spend recording problem. If one node is ignoring all spends that it does not care about, it suffers no adverse consequences.
Satoshi answered, With the transaction fee-based incentive system I recently posted, nodes would have an incentive to include all the paying transactions they receive. Satoshi Nakamoto. James ended his email by claiming,
We need a protocol in which your prospects of becoming it also depend on being seen by other nodes as having a reasonably up-to-date and complete list of spends, which this protocol is not. And your protocol is not either.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 9. On November 13th, 2008, James Donald replied to Satoshi's remarks on how nodes work to prevent double spending. In this long email, the Byzantine generals problem is brought up for the first time ever in Bitcoin history by James. The Byzantine generals problem is a classic concept in computer science, especially in distributed systems, that addresses the issue of reaching consensus in a network where some participants, or nodes, may be unreliable or malicious. Here's how it applies in the context of Bitcoin. Imagine a scenario where multiple generals are spread out around an enemy city. They need to agree on a coordinated plan of attack, but can only communicate by messenger. Some of the generals, or messengers, may be traitors who will try to confuse or mislead the others, making it difficult to reach a unified decision. The problem lies in ensuring that all loyal generals agree on the same plan, even in the presence of traitors. In Bitcoin, the network is decentralized, and participant nodes don't inherently trust each other, since they can receive the same data from multiple peer nodes to double-check information that is self-verifying by its mathematical nature. This lack of trust between nodes mirrors the Byzantine generals problem, where some nodes may act maliciously or send conflicting information to disrupt consensus. Bitcoin addresses this problem in several ways. First, with proof of work, Bitcoin's consensus algorithm requires nodes, or who we now call miners, solve a mathematical puzzle to validate transactions and add blocks of transactions to the blockchain. This process is computationally expensive and resource-intensive, making it difficult for malicious actors to alter the blockchain without a majority of the network's computing power. But even though it's expensive to produce new blocks, it's very, very cheap to verify them as valid proofs of work by Bitcoin node runners. Second, Bitcoin's distributed ledger is held by all 75,000 Bitcoin nodes all over the world who maintain a copy of the blockchain, and consensus on the longest chain is reached when the majority of nodes accept a newly mined block as valid. If any minority miner or node tries to add a fraudulent block with double-spent coins, it will be rejected by the rest of the network, ensuring that only legitimate transactions are recorded. Third, in Bitcoin, the longest chain of blocks with the most proof of work is considered the valid one. This means that if a malicious actor tries to create an alternative version of the blockchain, they would need to continuously outpace the honest miner's block production, which is practically infeasible due to the cost and difficulty of being a majority of the hash power on the network. Currently, the Bitcoin network hash rate is at an all-time high of 755 billion terahashes a second, distributed over thousands of locations, several dozen countries, and mining pools. Bitcoin's solution and the Byzantine generals problem doesn't prevent malicious actors from attempting to interfere, but it makes successful attacks prohibitively expensive and unlikely by aligning incentives. Miners are incentivized to act honestly because they are rewarded with Bitcoin for valid mining, while dishonest behavior is likely to result in lost resources with no reward. Thus, Bitcoin's consensus mechanism achieves reliable coordination in a trustless, decentralized network, solving the Byzantine generals problem by ensuring that all non-malicious nodes agree on the true order of transactions and state of the blockchain. Digressing, here is James's email to Satoshi, where he mentions the Byzantine generals problem for the first time in Bitcoin's history. Quote,
That is not the question I am asking. It is not trust that worries me. It is how it is possible to have a globally shared view, even if everyone is well behaved. The process for arriving at a globally shared view of who owns what gold coins is insufficiently specified. Once specified, then we can start considering whether everyone has incentives to behave correctly. It is not sufficient that everyone knows X. We also need everyone to know that everyone knows X, and that everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows X, which, as in the Byzantine generals problem, is the classic hard problem of distributed data processing. This problem becomes harder when X is quite possibly a very large amount of data. Agreement on who was the owner of every bit gold coin at such and such a time. And then, on top of that, we need everyone to have a motive, to behave in such a fashion that agreement arises. I cannot see that they have motive when I do not know the behavior to be motivated. You keep repeating your analysis of the system under attack. We cannot say how the system will behave under attack until we know how the system is supposed to behave when not under attack. If there are a lot of transactions, it is hard to efficiently discover the discrepancies between one node's view and another node's view. And because new transactions are always arriving, no two nodes will ever have the same view, even if all nodes are honest and all reported transactions are correct and true single spends. We should be able to accomplish a system where two nodes are likely to come to agreement as to who owned what bit gold coins at some very recent past time. But it is not simple to do so. If one node constructs a hash that represents its knowledge of who owned what bit gold coins at a particular time, and another node wants to check that hash, it is not simple to do it in such a way that agreement is likely and disagreement between honest, well-behaved nodes is efficiently detected and efficiently resolved. And if we had a specification of how agreement is generated, it is not obvious why the second node has incentive to check that hash. The system has to work in such a way that nodes can easily and cheaply change their opinion about recent transactions, so as to reach consensus. But in order to provide finality and irreversibility, once consensus has been reached, and then new stuff has been piled on top of old consensus, in particular, new bit gold has been piled on top of old consensus, it then becomes extremely difficult to go back and change what was decided. Saying that is how it works does not give us a method to make it work that way. Furthermore, in regards to your comments on how the receiver of a payment must wait an hour or so before believing that a transaction is valid, and that the network will resolve any possible double-spend races by then. You keep discussing attacks. I find it hard to think about response to attack when it is not clear to me what normal behavior is, in the case of good conduct by each and every party. Distributed databases are hard, even when all the databases perfectly follow the will of a single owner. Messages get lost. Links drop, synchronization delays become abnormal, and entire machines go up in flames. And the network as a whole has to take all this in its stride. Figuring out how to do this is hard, even in the complete absence of attacks. Then, when we have figured out how to handle all this, then come attacks.
On the same day, Satoshi sent back this response. Quote, "The proof-of-work chain is a solution to the Byzantine generals' problem." I'll try to rephrase it in that context. A number of Byzantine generals each have a computer and want to attack the king's Wi-Fi by brute forcing the password, which they've learned is a certain number of characters in length. Once they stimulate the network to generate a packet, they must crack the password within a limited time to break in and erase the logs, otherwise they will be discovered and get in trouble. They only have enough CPU power to crack it fast enough if a majority of them attack at the same time. They don't particularly care when the attack will be, just that they all agree. It has been decided that anyone who feels like it will announce a time, and whatever time is heard first will be the official attack time. The problem is that the network is not instantaneous, and if two generals announce different attack times at close to the same time, some may hear one first, and others hear the other first. They use a proof-of-work chain to solve the problem. Once each general receives whatever attack time he hears first, he sets his computer to solve an extremely difficult proof-of-work problem that includes the attack time in its hash. The proof-of-work is so difficult it's expected to take 10 minutes of them all working at once before one of them finds a solution. Once one of the generals finds a proof of work, he broadcasts it to the network, and everyone changes their current proof of work computation to include that proof of work in the hash they're working on. If anyone was working on a different attack time, they switch to this one because its proof of work chain is now longer. After 2 hours, one attack time should be hashed by a chain of 12 proofs of work. Every general, just by verifying the difficulty of the proof-of-work chain, can estimate how much parallel CPU power per hour was expended on it, and see that it must have required the majority of the computers to produce that much proof-of-work in the allotted time. They had to all have seen it because the proof-of-work is proof that they worked on it. If the CPU power exhibited by the proof-of-work chain is sufficient to crack the password, they can safely attack at the agreed time. The proof-of-work chain is how all the synchronization, distributed database, and global view problems you've asked about are solved.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 10. The following is the second email exchange between Hal Finney and Satoshi Nakamoto on November 13th and 14th, 2008. Some interesting things to note in these emails is that Hal Finney is the first one to use the term blockchain in Bitcoin's history. The closest thing to the term blockchain being mentioned before this is by Satoshi in his white paper, where he uses the verbiage, a chain of blocks. But the credit for the term blockchain goes to Hal Finney, who is the first one to use such a phrase in these emails. Another interesting detail in these emails is that Hal is the one who suggested Satoshi use SourceForge.com to host Bitcoin's source code, but it turns out that Satoshi had already registered the Bitcoin SourceForge project on November 9th, 2008, which was a few days before this email with Hal Finney. Also on the same day, just before the Bitcoin SourceForge project was registered, James Donald was telling Satoshi that Bitcoin does not work and that it cannot be made to work. Satoshi ended up proving him wrong on this claim. Related to this SourceForge activity, Satoshi registered a SourceForge account with the username Nakamoto2 on October 5th, 2008, which was 4 weeks before the Bitcoin white paper was published on October 31st. In any case, on November the 13th, 2008, there was an email exchange between Hal Finney and Satoshi Nakamoto. Hal began his comments by quoting a portion of a conversation between Satoshi and James Donald that highlighted James's frustration with the lack of functional detail for how Bitcoin would work. Hal agreed with James on this point by saying, quote,
I agree that the description is not completely clear on how these matters are handled. Satoshi has suggested that releasing source code may be the best way to clarify the design. As I have tried to work through details on my own, it does appear that the rules become rather complicated, and indeed, one needs at least a pseudocode algorithm to specify the behavior. So perhaps writing real code is not a bad way to go. I found that there is a SourceForge project set up for BitGold, although it does not have any code yet. In answer to James's specific question about what happens when different nodes see different sets of transactions due to imperfect broadcast, here is how I understand it. Each node must be prepared to maintain potentially several candidate blockchains, each of which may eventually turn out to become the longest one, the one which wins. Once a given blockchain becomes sufficiently longer than a competitor, the shorter one can be deleted. This length differential is a parameter which depends on the node's threat model for how much compute power an attacker can marshal, in terms of the fraction of the honest peer-to-peer network's work capacity, and is estimated in the paper. The idea is that once a chain gets far enough behind the longest one, there is essentially no chance that it can ever catch up. In order to resolve the issue James raised, I think it is necessary that nodes keep a separate pending transaction list associated with each candidate chain. This list would include all transactions the node has received via broadcast by the transactees, but which have not yet been incorporated into that blockchain. At any given time, the node is working to extend the longest blockchain, and the block it is working to find a hash collision for will include all of the pending transactions associated with that chain. I think that this way, when a candidate chain is deleted because it got too much shorter than the longest one, transactions in it are not lost, but have continued to be present in the pending transaction list associated with the longest chain, in those nodes which heard the original transaction broadcast. I have also considered whether nodes should add transactions to their pending transaction list that they learn about through blocks from other nodes, even if those blocks do not end up making their way into the longest blockchain. But I'm not sure if that is necessary or helpful. Once these rules are clarified, more formal modeling will be helpful in understanding the behavior of the network given imperfect reliability. For example, if we let variable f represent the average fraction of peer-to-peer nodes who receive a given transaction broadcast, then I think one would expect 1 divided by f times block creation time would equal the time to elapse before the transaction appears in what is destined to become the longest chain. One might also ask, given that the peer-to-peer network broadcast is itself imperfectly reliable, how many candidate chains must a given node keep track of at one time, on average? Satoshi answered this question with, quote,
Fortunately, it's only necessary to keep a pending transaction pool for the current best branch. When a new block arrives for the best branch, connect block removes the block's transactions from the pending transaction pool. If a different branch becomes longer, it calls disconnect block on the main branch down to the fork, returning the block transactions to the pending transaction pool, and calls connect block on the new branch, sopping back up any transactions that were in both branches. It's expected that reorgs like this would be rare and shallow. With this optimization, candidate branches are not really any burden. They just sit on the disk and don't require attention unless they ever become the main chain.
Hal then asked Satoshi, quote, as James raised earlier, if the network broadcast is reliable, but depends on a potentially slow flooding algorithm, how does that impact performance? Satoshi answered, quote,
broadcasts will probably be almost completely reliable. TCP transmissions are rarely ever dropped these days, and the broadcast protocol has a retry mechanism to get the data from other nodes after a while. If broadcasts turn out to be slower in practice than expected, the target time between blocks may have to be increased to avoid wasting resources. We want blocks to usually propagate in much less time than it takes to generate them, otherwise nodes would spend too much time working on obsolete blocks. I'm planning to run an automated test with computers randomly sending payments to each other and randomly dropping packets.
Hal then continued his email by quoting James Donald, who said, we need everyone to have a motive to behave in such a fashion that agreement arises. I cannot see that they have motive when I do not know the behavior to be motivated. Hal remarked on this by saying, quote, I am somewhat less worried about motivation. I'd be satisfied if the system can meet the following criteria. 1. No single node operator or small collection of node operators which controls only a small fraction of overall network resources, can effectively cheat if other players are honest. 2. The long tail of node operators is sufficiently large that no small collection of nodes can control more than a small fraction of overall resources. Here, the tail refers to a ranking based on amount of resources controlled by each operator. 3. The Bitcoin system turns out to be socially useful and valuable, so that node operators feel that they are making a beneficial contribution to the world by their efforts, similar to the various at-home compute projects where people volunteer their compute resources for good causes. In this case, it seems to me that simple altruism can suffice to keep the network running properly. Satoshi replied to this part of Hal's email by saying,
It's very attractive to the libertarian viewpoint if we can explain it properly. I'm better with code than with words, though. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Hal concluded his email by quoting James and agreeing with his comment about how distributed databases are hard and subject to abnormal delays. Hal went on to say, quote, "A more complete specification is necessary in order to understand how the network will respond to imperfections like this. I am looking forward to seeing more detail emerge. One thing I might mention is that in many ways, Bitcoin is two independent ideas, a way of solving the kinds of problems James lists here, of creating a globally consistent but decentralized database, and then using it for a system similar to Wei Dai's B-Money, which is referenced in the paper, but transaction coin-based, rather than account-based. Solving the global, massively decentralized database problem is arguably the harder part, as James emphasizes. The use of proof of work as a tool for this purpose is a novel idea well worth further review in my opinion. Hal Finney.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 11.
On November the 14th, 2008, Satoshi replied to a long email by Ray Dillinger, who tried to summarize his understanding of the Bitcoin protocol. In Satoshi's reply to Dillinger, he explicitly confirms for the first time that Bitcoin will have a capped supply, which is only implied in the white paper and elsewhere by Satoshi up to this point in time. Dillinger began his email with, quote, "Okay, I'm going to summarize this protocol as I understand it. I'm filling in some operational details that aren't in the paper by supplementing what you wrote with what my own design sense tells me are critical missing bits, or obvious methodologies for use. First, people spend computer power creating a pool of coins to use as money. Each coin is a proof-of-work meeting whatever criteria were in effect for money at the time it was created. The time of creation, and therefore the criteria, is checkable later because people can see the emergence of this particular coin in the transaction chain and track it through all its consensus view spends. More later on, coin creation tied to adding a link. When a coin is spent, the buyer and seller digitally sign a blinded transaction record and broadcast it to a bunch of nodes whose purpose is keeping track of consensus regarding coin ownership. Satoshi interjected here with, quote,
Only the buyer signs, and there's no blinding. Satoshi also said, I'll try and hurry up and release the source code as soon as possible to serve as a reference to help clear up all these implementation questions.
Dillinger then asserted, quote, if someone double spends, then the transaction record can be unblinded, revealing the identity of the cheater. To which Satoshi replied, quote,
Identities are not used, and there's no reliance on recourse. It's all prevention.
Dillinger then guessed, quote, this is done via a fairly standard cut-and-choose algorithm, where the buyer responds to several challenges with secret shares, and the seller then asks him to unblind and checks all but one verifying that they do contain secret shares, any two of which are sufficient to identify the buyer. Satoshi clarified, quote,
No challenges or secret shares. A basic transaction is just what you see in the figure in Section 2, a signature of the buyer, satisfying the public key of the previous transaction, and a new public key of the seller that must be satisfied to spend it the next time.
Dillinger went on to say, quote, In this case, the seller accepts the unblinded spend record as probably containing a valid secret share. The nodes keeping track of consensus regarding coin ownership are in a loop, where they are all trying to add a link to the longest chain they've so far received. They have a pool of reported transactions which they've not yet seen in a consensus-signed chain. I'm going to call this Pool A. They attempt to add a link to the chain by moving everything from Pool A into a Pool L and using a CPU, intensive digital signature algorithm, to sign the chain, including the new block L. Satoshi answered this with, quote,
It's a Hashcash style SHA-256 proof of work partial pre-image of 0, not a signature.
Dillinger continued his email with, quote, This results in a chain extended by a block containing all the transaction records they had in Pool L, plus the node's digital signature. While they do this, new transaction records continue to arrive and go into Pool A, again for the next cycle of work. They may also receive chains as long as the one they're trying to extend while they work, in which the last few links are links that are not in common with the chain on which they're working. These they ignore. Question mark. Do they ignore them? Under what circumstances would these become necessary to ever look at again, bearing in mind that any longer chain based on them will include them? Satoshi answered this with, quote,
Right. If it's equal in length, ties are broken by keeping the earliest one received.
Dillinger went on to say, quote, But if they receive a longer chain while working, they immediately check all the transactions in the new links to make sure it contains no double spends, and that the work factors of all new links are appropriate. If it contains a double spend, then they create a transaction which is a proof of double spending. Add it to their Pool A, broadcast it, and continue work. Satoshi then addressed this misunderstanding by saying, quote,
There's no need for reporting of proof of double spending like that. If the same chain contains both spends, then the block is invalid and rejected. Same if a block didn't have enough proof of work. That block is invalid and rejected. There's no need to circulate a report about it. Every node could see that and reject it before relaying it. If there are two competing chains, each containing a different version of the same transaction, with one trying to give money to one person and the other trying to give the same money to someone else, resolving which of the spends is valid is what the whole proof of work chain is about. We're not on the lookout for double spends to sound the alarm and catch the cheater. We merely adjudicate which one of the spends is valid. Receivers of transactions must wait a few blocks to make sure that resolution has had time to complete. Would-be cheaters can try and simultaneously double spend all they want, and all they accomplish is that within a few blocks one of the spends becomes valid and the others become invalid. Any later double spends are immediately rejected once there's already a spend in the main chain. Even if an earlier spend wasn't in the chain yet, if it was already in all the nodes' pools, then the second spend would be turned away by all those nodes that already have the first spend.
Dillinger then said, quote, If one of the new links has an inappropriate work factor, i.e., someone didn't put enough CPU into it for it to be licit according to the rules, a new transaction, which is a proof of the protocol violation by the link-creating node, is created, broadcast, and added to Pool A, and the chain is rejected. In the case of no double spends and appropriate work factors for all links not yet seen, they accept the new chain as consensus. If the new chain is accepted, Then they give up on adding their current link, dump all the transactions from pool L back into pool A, along with transactions they've received or created since starting work. Eliminate from pool A those transaction records which are already part of a link in the new chain, and start work again, trying to extend the new chain. Satoshi validated this description with, quote,
Right. They also refresh whenever a new transaction comes in, so L pretty much contains everything in A all the time.
Dillinger went on to say, quote, if they complete work on a chain extended with their new link, they broadcast it, and immediately start work on another new link with all the transactions that have accumulated in pool A since they began work. Do I understand it correctly? Biggest technical problem. Is there a mechanism to make sure that the chain does not consist solely of links added by just the 3 or 4 fastest nodes? Because a broadcast transaction record could easily miss those 3 or 4 nodes, and if it does, and those nodes continue to dominate the chain, the transaction might never get added. Satoshi clarified this point with, quote,
If you're thinking of it as a CPU-intensive digital signing, then you may be thinking of a race to finish a long operation first and the fastest always winning. The proof of work is a Hashcash-style SHA-256 collision finding. It's a memory-less process where you do millions of hashes a second with a small chance of finding one each time. The 3 or 4 fastest nodes' dominance would only be proportional to their share of the total CPU power. Anyone's chance of finding a solution at any time is proportional to their CPU power. There will be transaction fees, so nodes will have an incentive to receive and include all the transactions they can. Nodes will eventually be compensated by transaction fees alone when the total coins created hits the predetermined ceiling.
This comment by Satoshi is the first time Bitcoin supply is confirmed as capped at a ceiling. But there is no mention of what that specific capped supply number will be yet. Ray Dillinger continues his comments by saying, quote, to remedy this, you need to either ensure provable propagation of transactions or vary the work factor for a node, depending on how many links have been added since that node's most recent link. Unfortunately, both measures can be defeated by sock puppets. This is probably the worst problem with your protocol as it stands right now. You need some central point to control the identities, keys, of the nodes, and prevent people from making new sock puppets. Provable propagation would mean that when Bob accepts a new chain from Alice, he needs to make sure that Alice has, or gets, all transactions in his A and L pools. He sends them, and Alice sends back a signed hash to prove she got them. Once Alice has received this block of transactions, if any subsequent chains, including a link added by Alice, do not include those transactions at or before that link, then Bob should be able to publish the block he sent Alice, along with her signature, in a transaction as proof that Alice violated protocol. Sock puppets defeat this because Alice just signed subsequent chains using a new key, pretending to be a different node. If we go with varying the work factor, depending on how many new links there are, then we're right back to domination by the 3 or 4 fastest nodes, except now they're joined by 600 or so sock puppets, which they use to avoid the work factor penalty. If we solve the sock puppet issue, or accept that there's a central point controlling the generation of new keys, then generation of coins should be tied to the act of successfully adding a block to the consensus chain. This is simple to do. Creation of a coin is a transaction. It gets added along with all the other transactions in the block. But you can only create one coin per link. And of course, if your version of the chain isn't the one that gets accepted, then in the accepted view, you don't have the coin and can't spend it. This gives the people maintaining the consensus database a reason to spend CPU cycles, especially since the variance in work factor by number of links added since their own last link, outlined above, guarantees that everyone, not just the 3 or 4 fastest nodes, occasionally gets the opportunity to create a coin. Also, the work requirement for adding a link to the chain should vary, again exponentially, with the number of links added to that chain in the previous week, causing the rate of coin generation, and therefore inflation, to be strictly controlled. On this last point by Dillinger describing the difficulty adjustment mechanism, Satoshi confirmed that he was, quote,
Right.
Dillinger went on to say, quote, You need coin aggregation for this to scale. There needs to be a provable transaction where someone retires 10 single coins and creates a new coin with denomination 10, etc. Satoshi addressed this point by explaining, quote,
Every transaction is one of these. Section 9, Combining and Splitting Value. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Dillinger, who also went by the call sign Bear, finished his email with, quote, This is not too hard, using the same infrastructure you've already got. It simply becomes part of the chain, and when the chain is accepted consensus, then everybody can see that it happened. Bear. Addendum. On November 17th, 3 days after the email exchange between Dillinger and Satoshi, James Donald sent his own set of answers to Ray Dillinger, outlining his thoughts on the questions he had about Bitcoin. Satoshi and Dillinger never directly replied to this email by James. In any case, James wrote the following. There are a number of significantly different ways this could be implemented. I have been working on my own version based on Patricia hash trees. Not yet ready to post, will post in a week or so. With the consensus generation being a generalization of file sharing using Merkle hash trees. Patricia hash trees, where the high-order part of the Patricia key represents the high-order part of the time, can be used to share data that evolves in time. The algorithm, if implemented by honest, correctly functioning peers, regularly generates consensus hashes of the recent past, thereby addressing the problem I have been complaining about. That we have a mechanism to protect against consensus distortion by dishonest or malfunctioning peers, which is useless, absent a definition of consensus generation by honest and correctly functioning peers. James then went on to address Dillinger's comment on the dynamics of his vision for how Bitcoin would work with blinding and unblinding. Quote, I don't think your blinding works. If there is a public record of who owns what coin, we have to generate a public difference on changes in that record. So the record will show that a coin belonged to X and soon thereafter belonged to Y. I don't think blinding can be made to work. We can blind the transaction details easily enough by only making hashes of the details public. X paid Y for 49 VR7X, but that X paid Y is going to be fairly obvious. If when Joe spends a coin to me, then I have to have the ability to ask, does Joe rightfully own this coin? Then it is difficult to see how this can be implemented in a distributed protocol without giving people the ability to trawl through data detecting that Joe paid me. To maintain a consensus on who owns what coins has to be public. We can build a privacy layer on top of this. Account money and Charmian money based on BitGold coins. Much as the pre-1915 U.S. banking system, layered account money and banknotes on top of gold coins. And indeed, we have to build a layer on top to bring the transaction cost down to the level that supports agents performing microtransactions. as needed for bandwidth control, file sharing, and charging non-white-listed people to send us communications. So the entities on the public record are entities functioning like pre-1915 banks. Let us call them BINCs. For post-1934, banks no longer function like that. James then commented on Dillinger's view for how double spending could be checked for with warning transmissions. Quote, "I am troubled that this involves frequent retransmissions of data that is already mostly known. Consensus and widely distributed beliefs about BitGold ownership already involves significant cost. Further, each transmission of data is subject to data loss, which can result in thrashing, with the risk that the generation of consensus may slow below the rate of new transactions. We already have problems getting the cost down to levels that support microtransactions by software agents, which is the big unserved market. Bandwidth control, file sharing, and charging non-white listed people to send us communications. To work as a useful project, it has to be as efficient as it can be. Hence my plan to use a Patricia hash tree, because it identifies and locates small discrepancies between peers that are mostly in agreement already, without them needing to transmit their complete data. We also want to avoid very long hash chains that have to be frequently checked in order to validate things. Anytime a hash chain can potentially become enormously long over time, we need to ensure that no one ever has to re-walk the full length. Chains that need to be re-walked can only be permitted to grow as the log of the total number of transactions. If they grow as the log of the transactions in any one time period plus the total number of time periods, we have a problem. James then added on to Dillinger's comments for what he thought the biggest technical challenges were. Quote, "We need a protocol wherein to be a money-tracking peer, an entity that validates spends. You have to be accepted by at least 2 existing peers who agree to synchronize data with you, presumably through human intervention by the owners of existing peers. And these 2 human-approved synchronization paths indirectly connect you to the other peers in the network through at least one graph cycle. If peer X is only connected to the rest of the network by one existing peer, peer Y, perhaps because X's directly connecting peer has dropped out, then X is demoted to a client, not a peer. Any transactions X submits are relabeled by Y as submitted to Y, not X, and the time of submission, which forms part of the Patricia key, is the time X submitted them to Y, not the time they were submitted to X. The algorithm must be able to swiftly detect malfunctioning peers and automatically exclude them from the consensus temporarily, which means that transactions submitted through malfunctioning peers do not get included in the consensus, therefore have to be resubmitted, and peers may find themselves temporarily demoted to clients because one of the peers through which they were formally connected to the network has been dropped by the consensus. If a peer gets a lot of automatic temporary exclusions, there may be human intervention by the owners of those peers to which it exchanges data directly to permanently drop them. Since peers get accepted by human invite, they have reputation to lose. Therefore, we can make the null hypothesis, the primary Bayesian prior, honest intent, valid data, but unreliable data transmission. Trust with infrequent random verification. Designing the system on this basis considerably reduces processing costs. Recall that SETR died on its ass, in large part because every transaction involved innumerable public key operations. Similarly, we have huge security flaws in HTTPS because it has so many redundant public key operations, that website designers try to minimize the use of HTTPS to cover only those areas that truly need it, and they always get the decision as to what truly needs it subtly wrong. Efficiency is critical, particularly as the part of the market not yet served is the market for very low-cost transactions. James then addressed Dillinger's comment on accepting centralization, saying, "A central point will invite attack, will be attacked." The problem with computer-networked money is that the past can so easily be revised. So nodes come under pressure to adjust the past. "I did not pay that" swiftly becomes "I should not have paid that," which requires arbitration, which is costly, and introduces uncertainty, which is costly, and invites government regulation, which is apt to be utterly ruinous and wholly devastating. For many purposes, reversal and arbitration is highly desirable. But there is no way anyone can compete with the arbitration provided by Visa and MasterCard. For they have network effects on their side, and they do a really good job of arbitration, at which they have vast experience, accumulated skills, wisdom, and good repute. So any new networked transaction system has to target the demand for final and irreversible transactions. The idea of a distributed network consensus is that one has a lot of peers in a lot of jurisdictions, and once a transaction has entered into the consensus, undoing it is damn near impossible. One would have to pressure most of the peers in most of the jurisdictions to agree, and many of them don't even talk your language. And those that do will probably pretend that they do not, so people will not even try. To avoid pressure, the network has to avoid any central point at which pressure can be applied. Recall Nero's wish that Rome had a single throat that he could cut. If we provide them with such a throat, it will be cut.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 12.
On Saturday, November the 15th, Satoshi received another follow-up email from Ray Dillinger, to which he gave a reply on the same day. The following is a dialogue of this email exchange. Dillinger begins by quoting Satoshi's comment for how no blinding or identities are used in Bitcoin. It's all prevention-based. Dillinger goes on to say, quote, "Okay, that's surprising. If you're not using buyer-seller identities, then you are not checking that a spend is being made by someone who actually is the owner of, on record as having received, the coin being spent. There are 3 categories of identity that are useful to think about. Category 1, public. Real-world identities are a matter of record and attached to every transaction. Category 2, pseudonymous. There are persistent identities within the system, and people can see if something was done by the same NIM that did something else. But there's not necessarily any way of linking the NIMs with real-world identities. Category 3, unlinkably anonymous. There is no concept of identity, persistent or otherwise. No one can say or prove whether the agents involved in any transaction are the same agents as involved in any other transaction. Are you claiming Category 3, as you seem to be, or Category 2? Lots of people don't distinguish between anonymous and pseudonymous protocols, so it's worth asking exactly what you mean here. Anyway, I'll proceed on the assumption that you meant very nearly as I can imagine, anyway. What you said, unlinkably anonymous. That means that instead of an identity, a spender has to demonstrate knowledge of a secret known only to the real owner of the coin. One way to do this would be to have the person receiving the coin generate an asymmetric key pair, and then have half of it published with the transaction. In order to spend the coin later, she must demonstrate possession of the other half of the asymmetric key pair, probably by using it to sign the key provided by the new seller. Satoshi validated this interpretation by saying, quote,
Right, it's ECC digital signatures. A new key pair is used for every transaction. It's not pseudonymous in the sense of NIMs identifying people, but it is at least a little pseudonymous in that the next action on a coin can be identified as being from the owner of that coin.
Dillinger continued his line of thinking with, quote, So we cannot prove anything about identity, but we can prove that the spender of the coin is someone who knows a secret that the person who received the coin knows. And what you say next seems to confirm this, i.e., no challenges or secret shares. Note, even though this doesn't involve identity per se, it still makes the agent doing the spend linkable to the agent who earlier received the coin. So these transactions are linkable. In order to counteract this, the owner of the coin needs to make a transaction, indistinguishable to others from any normal transaction, in which he creates a new key pair and transfers the coin to its possessor, i.e., has one sock puppet spend it to another. No change in real-world identity of the owner. But the transaction linkable to the agent who spent the coin is unlinked. For Category 3 unlinkability, this has to be done a random number of times, maybe 1 to 6 times. By the way, could you please learn to use carriage returns? Your lines are scrolling stupidly off to the right, and I have to scroll to see what the heck you're saying, then edit to add carriage returns before I respond. As for your comment about how no report of bad actors is circulated, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. You're saying there's no effort to identify and exclude nodes that don't cooperate? I suspect this will lead to trouble and possible DOS attacks. To which Satoshi replied, quote,
There is no reliance on identifying anyone. As you've said, it's futile and can be trivially defeated with sock puppets. The credential that establishes someone as real is the ability to supply CPU power.
Dillinger then went on to ask some more questions about double spending transactions. Quote, When you say same transaction, and you're talking about transactions that are obviously different, you mean a double spend, right? 2 transactions signed with the same key? And as for waiting a few blocks to make sure that resolution has had time to complete. Until what? How does anybody know when a transaction has become irrevocable? Is a few blocks 3, 30, 100? Does it depend on the number of nodes? Is it logarithmic or linear in number of nodes? Satoshi responded to this by saying, quote,
Section 11 calculates the worst case under attack. Typically, 5 or 10 blocks is enough for that. If you're selling something that doesn't merit a network scale attack to steal it, in practice you could cut it closer.
Dillinger went on to say, quote, In the absence of identity, there's no downside to them if spends become invalid. If they've already received the goods they double spent for, access to website, download, whatever, the merchants are left holding the bag with invalid coins, unless they wait that magical few blocks. And how can they know how many? Before treating the spender as having paid. The consumers won't do this if they spend their coin and it takes an hour to clear before they can do what they spent their coin on. The merchants won't do it if there's no way to charge back a customer when they find that their coin is invalid because the customer has double spent. Satoshi replied, quote,
This is a version 2 problem that I believe can be solved fairly satisfactorily for most applications. The race is to spread your transaction on the network first. Think 6 degrees of freedom. It spreads exponentially. It would only take something like 2 minutes for a transaction to spread widely enough that a competitor starting late would have little chance of grabbing very many nodes before the first one is overtaking the whole network. During those 2 minutes, the merchant's nodes can be watching for a double spent transaction. The double spender would not be able to blast his alternate transaction out to the world without the merchant getting it, so he has to wait before starting. If the real transaction reaches 90% and the double spent transaction reaches 10%, the double spender only gets a 10% chance of not paying and 90% chance his money gets spent. For almost any type of goods, that's not going to be worth it for the scammer. Information-based goods like access to website or downloads are non-fencible. Nobody is going to be able to make a living off stealing access to websites or downloads. They can go to the file-sharing networks to steal that. Most instant access products aren't going to have a huge incentive to steal. If a merchant actually has a problem with theft, they can make the customer wait 2 minutes or wait for something in email, which many already do. If they really want to optimize and it's a large download, they could cancel the download in the middle if the transaction comes back double spent. If it's website access, typically it wouldn't be a big deal to let the customer have access for 5 minutes and then cut off access if it's rejected. Many such sites have a free trial anyway. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Dillinger then finished his email to Satoshi, quote, "So there's a possibility of an early catch when the broadcasts of the initial simultaneous spends interfere with each other. I assume here that the broadcasts are done by the sellers, since the buyer has a possible disincentive to broadly disseminate spends. When you say L pretty much contains everything in A all the time. That's a big difference between a proof of work that takes a huge set number of CPU cycles and a proof of work that takes a tiny number of CPU cycles but has a tiny chance of success. You can change the data set while working, and it doesn't mean you need to start over. This is good in this case, as it means nobody has to hold recently received transactions out of the link they're working on. Also, your comment about CPU-intensive digital signing as a race to finish a long operation first, and the fastest always winning. That was the misconception I was working with. Again, the difference between a proof taking a huge set number of CPU cycles and a proof that takes a tiny number of CPU cycles but has a tiny chance of success. As for your comment confirming anyone's chance of finding a solution at any time is proportional to their CPU power. It's like a random variation in the work factor. In this way, it works in your favor. And lastly, on your comment explaining that there will be transaction fees. I don't understand how transaction fees would work, and how the money would find its way from the agents doing transactions to those running the network. But the economic effect is the same, albeit somewhat randomized. If adding a link to the chain allows the node to create a coin, so I would stick with that. Also, be aware that the compute power of different nodes can be expected to vary by 2 orders of magnitude at any given moment in history. Bear. Addendum. 2 more shorter add-on emails follow this email chain. The first one was on Monday, November 17th, from Nicholas Williams, a lead software engineer at Oracle. He replied to Dillinger and Satoshi's comments related to how there are no specific identities used in Bitcoin. Quote, "How do identities help? It's supposed to be anonymous cash, right? And say you identify a double spender after the fact, then what? Perhaps you're looking at a disposable ID. Or perhaps you can't chase them down. Double spend detection needs to be real-time or near real-time." Nico. The second add-on email was by James Donald and replied to this comment by Nicholas. Quote, "Actually, no. It is, however, supposed to be pseudonymous, so dinging someone's reputation still does not help much. Also, near real-time means we have to use UDP, or equivalent, rather than TCP, or equivalent, and we have to establish an approximate consensus. Not necessarily the final consensus, not necessarily exact agreement, but close to it, in a reasonably small number of round trips. Satoshi never followed up on these last two add-on emails by James and Nicholas.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 13.
On the 15th and 17th of November 2008, James Donald and Satoshi Nakamoto exchanged emails. The following is the dialogue of these two emails, starting with James commenting on Satoshi's remark that it's only necessary to keep a pending transaction pool for the current best branch. James replied, quote, "This requires that we know, that is to say, an honest, well-behaved peer whose communications and data storage is working well, knows what the current best branch is. But of course, the problem is that we are trying to converge upon a best branch, which is not easy at the best of times, and becomes harder when another peer is lying about its connectivity and capabilities, and yet another peer has just had a major disk drive failure obfuscated by a software crash, and the international fibers connecting yet a third peer have been attacked by terrorists." Satoshi replied to this comment by James with, quote,
A node only needs the pending transaction pool for the best branch it has. The branch that it currently thinks is the best branch, that's the branch it'll be trying to make a block out of, which is all it needs the pool for.
James went on to claim that if a different branch becomes longer, this then, quote, presupposes the branches exist, that they are fully specified and complete. If they exist as complete works, rather than works in progress, then the problem is already solved, for the problem is making progress. Also, when it comes to reliability, there is a trade-off between timeliness and reliability. One can make a broadcast arbitrarily reliable if time is of no consequence. However, when one is talking of distributed data, time is always of consequence, because it is all about synchronization, that peers need to have corresponding views at corresponding times. So when one does distributed data processing, broadcasts are always highly unreliable. Attempts to ensure that each message arrives at least once result in increased timing variation. Thus, one has to make a protocol that is either UDP or somewhat UDP-like. In that, messages are small. Failure of messages to arrive is common. Messages can arrive in different order to the order in which they were sent, and the same message may arrive multiple times. Either we have UDP, or we need to accommodate the same problems as UDP has on top of TCP connections. Rather than assuming that each message arrives at least once, we have to make a mechanism such that the information arrives even though conveyed by messages that frequently fail to arrive. Satoshi replied to this with, quote,
I think I've got the peer networking broadcast mechanism covered. Each node sends its neighbors an inventory list of hashes of the new blocks and transactions it has. The neighbors request the items they don't have yet. If the item never comes through after a timeout, they request it from another neighbor that had it. Since all or most of the neighbors should eventually have each item, even if the comms get fumbled up with one, they can get it from any of the others, trying one at a time. The inventory request data scheme introduces a little latency, but it ultimately helps speed more by keeping extra data blocks off the transmit queues and conserving bandwidth.
James continued his email by addressing the claim that TCP transmissions are rarely ever dropped these days. Quote, people always load connections near maximum. When a connection is near maximum, TCP connections suffer frequent, unreasonably long delays, and connections simply fail a lot. Your favorite web cartoon somehow shows it is loading forever, and you try again. Or it comes up with a little X in place of a picture, and you try again. Further, very long connections, for example, FTP downloads of huge files, seldom complete. If you try to FTP a movie, you are unlikely to get anywhere unless both client and server have a resume mechanism so that they can talk about partially downloaded files. UDP connections, for example, Skype video calls, also suffer frequent picture freezes, loss of quality, and so forth, and have to have mechanisms to keep going regardless. As for your assertion that Bitcoin is very attractive to the libertarian viewpoint, if we can explain it properly. No, it is very attractive to the libertarian if we can design a mechanism that will scale to the point of providing the benefits of rapidly irreversible payment, immune to political interference, over the internet to very large numbers of people. You have an outline and proposal for such a design, which is a big step forward, but the devil is in the little details. I really should provide a fleshed-out version of your proposal, rather than nagging you to fill out the blind spots. Satoshi then finished his reply by saying, quote,
I believe I've worked through all those little details over the last year and a half while coding it, and there were a lot of them. The functional details are not covered in the paper, but the source code is coming soon. I sent you the main files. Available by request at the moment. Full release soon. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Addendum. After Satoshi sent this final public email, the moderator of the cryptography mailing list called for an end to the Bitcoin discussion. Quote, I'd like to call an end to the Bitcoin e-cash discussion for now. A lot of discussion is happening that would be better accomplished by people writing papers at the moment rather than rehashing things back and forth. Maybe later on when Satoshi, or someone else, writes something detailed up and posts it, we could have another round of this. Perry. The cryptography mailing list doesn't hear from Satoshi again until early January 2009, when the Bitcoin network is launched, and he announces version 0.1 of Bitcoin.
Chapter 1 of Satoshi, Part 14. The first 13 episodes of this Satoshi series focused on the public cryptography mailing list conversations in reaction to the release of the Bitcoin white paper. In summary of this first chapter, we can see that Satoshi is very tight-lipped about the specifics of Bitcoin surrounding its supply numbers, issuance schedule, and its monetary policy. He still has not revealed Bitcoin supply numbers in November of 2008. This is likely because he was still ironing out those details and getting feedback on them from people like Ray Dillinger. Overall, Satoshi reveals his shrewdness with this opening salvo to the world on the cryptography mailing list. It appears his goal was to make a low-key announcement of Bitcoin while recruiting interest from the brightest minds in freedom technology at the time, who likely helped him review his code before the network was launched in January of 2009. In these conversations, Satoshi doesn't make too many extreme political claims or remarks, but rather focuses on the technology itself rather than the political implications. Satoshi also had good emotional intelligence and social grace. He didn't take offense to any of the several abrasive emails he received, was gracious, polite, said sorry in one instance when he didn't need to. He was also to the point, but not curt, while often avoiding unnecessary confrontations. But sometimes he was confusing in his explanations of details or in the way he responded when he could have been much more clear. Perhaps this was intentional, as a way to show his frustration or disapproval with some replies he received passive-aggressively. But it also could have been a compulsion for the tangential, or he could have just been tired when responding. In any case, I hope this first chapter helped showcase some of Satoshi's characteristics and the social environment surrounding Bitcoin at its conception. Furthermore, as the Bitcoin conversation was shut down on the public cryptography mailing list, it went underground in private emails between Hal Finney, James Donald, Ray Dillinger, Nicholas Williams, David Mercer, Wei Dai, Adam Back, and Satoshi Nakamoto. There were likely more people involved, but those are the names we know of on private emails now publicly released. The contents of these emails are still mostly unknown, but one of them from Hal Finney to Satoshi resurfaced.
In 2020, CoinDesk published an article revealing private emails between Hal Finney and Satoshi Nakamoto. One of these emails was from Hal to Satoshi on Wednesday, November 19, 2008, which came right after the Bitcoin white paper conversation was shut down on the cryptography mailing list. In this private email, Hal asks Satoshi, quote, I see. Thanks for the corrections. Some of the discussion and concern over performance may relate to the eventual size of the peer-to-peer node network. How large do you envision it becoming? Tens of nodes? Thousands? Millions? And for clients, do you think this could scale to be usable for close to 100% of world financial transactions? Or would you see it as mostly being used for some core subset of transactions that have special requirements, with other transactions using a different payment system that perhaps is based on Bitcoin? Hal.
Analysis. We don't know what private conversation details preceded this email by Hal, but we may have found Satoshi's reply buried in Marty Malmi's recently released emails with Satoshi. Marty, also known as Sirius, was the second official developer to work on Bitcoin after Hal Finney drifted away. Marty's email conversations with Satoshi were made public in 2024 and spanned from 2009 to 2011. Marty's third email with Satoshi included dozens of prior email answers Satoshi gave privately with others before May 2009. One of these emails matches up exactly as an answer to Hal Finney's November 19, 2008 email. It reads as follows.
100,000 block-generating nodes is a good ballpark large-scale size to think about. Propagating a transaction across the whole network twice would consume a total of 2 cents of bandwidth at today's prices. In practice, many would be burning off excess allocated bandwidth or unlimited plans with one of the cheaper backbones. There could be millions of SPV clients. They only matter in how many transactions they generate. If they pay 1 or 2 cents transaction fees, they pay for themselves. I've coded it so you can pay any optional amount of transaction fees you want. When the incentive subsidy eventually tapers off, it may be necessary to put a market-determined transaction fee on your transactions to make sure nodes process them promptly. To think about what a really huge transaction load would look like, I look at the existing credit card network. I found some more estimates about how many transactions are online purchases. It's about 15 million transactions per day for the entire e-commerce load of the internet worldwide. At 1 kilobyte per transaction, that would be 15 gigabytes of bandwidth for each block generating node per day, or about 2 DVD movies worth. Seems doable even with today's technology. Important to remember, even if Bitcoin caught on at .com rates of growth, it would still take years to become any substantial fraction of all transactions. I believe hardware has already recently become strong enough to handle large scale, but if there's any doubt about that, bandwidth speeds, prices, disk space, and computing power will be much greater by the time it's needed. Satoshi.
There are a few interesting things to notice here. One is from Satoshi's last email on the cryptography mailing list, where he publicly says to James Donald, "I sent you the main files." These files were the Bitcoin source code for draft Bitcoin client software. Also, we can see from the Hal Finney private email that the subject heading reads RE, Bitcoin source files attached, with James, Hal, and Ray Dillinger CC'd. Therefore, Satoshi sent the Bitcoin source code files to not just James, but also Ray Dillinger and Hal too. This draft code eventually resurfaced in 2013 when Ray Dillinger published a copy of the files to the infamous Bitcoin Talk forums. Within them are a treasure trove of interesting variations on the parameters the currently defined Bitcoin, including its 21 million supply cap. Satoshi had apparently been working on this code for more than a year and a half. More analysis on this draft code in our next video.
If you want to support more of this kind of content, visit shopbitcoin.shop.